Well, the idea that racism is somehow hardwired into our brains and a natural phenomenon is a very old one and a very strong one. One example, a couple of years ago, the Daily Mail ran a story under the headline, "The Roots of Racism Are in Our Brains," which was based on a study, a supposed scientific study, which apparently showed that when we watch someone from what they call our own race do something, whatever it is, our brain simulates the action mentally as a form of empathy. But when we see somebody of a so-called different race do the same thing, we make much less effort to empathise. Now, leaving aside the fact that there is actually no scientific basis for the division of society into races, the implication of lurid stories like this is the idea that we see repeated again and again, that prejudice is natural, that people are bound, we can hear this with the Eastleigh by-election, the echoes of this, the idea that people are bound to have natural concerns about our normal culture being swamped by alien forces from Bulgaria or wherever else the latest scare story is from. And the idea really built into this is that any attempt to get rid of racist ideas are doomed. And I really want to argue against this understanding of racism. I want to argue that it's not natural, it hasn't always existed, and therefore it shouldn't always have to exist. And I want to say some things about where it came from and what that means in terms of how we can have a strategy to try and get rid of it. You see, if racism and racial prejudice were a feature of all human societies and of all human nature, then it would be an unchanging and permanent feature of every society that we looked at. But it's not. And not only has the nature of racism itself changed as societies have developed, so the targets of racism have changed, the language of racism has changed. We've seen, attempts to use scientific ways of explaining racism. We've seen attempts at cultural forms of racism. We've seen different groups of people, Jewish people, Irish people, Muslims, black people, targeted at different times. So not only has the nature of racism changed, but it's also true that there is ample evidence that for most of human history, racism simply didn't exist in the form of which we talk about it today. So, for example, people in the ancient worlds didn't regard skin colour as any more important than any other feature of human beings than eye colour or hair colour or any other feature. So tomb paintings from ancient Egypt, for example, depict people of all colours, light brown, black, in a fairly random and interchangeable way. It's clear from various historical studies that the Greeks and the Romans didn't believe that white-skinned people were inherently superior in any way. In fact, we can be almost certain, and when I say almost certain, this is precisely because people weren't divided into races in the way that they are today in Roman times, but we can be almost certain that the Roman Emperor Septimus Severus, for example, was black. And as the Trinidadian Marxist scholar C.L.R. James put it, historically it is pretty well proved now that the ancient Greeks and Romans knew nothing about race. They had another standard, civilised and barbarian, and you could have a white skin and be a barbarian, and you could be black and be civilised. And what this means is early explorers from medieval Europe didn't believe that their societies were necessarily superior to those that they visited, very unlike actually the so-called explorers from Europe today or under colonialism. In 1600, a Dutch trader, for example, entering the city of Benin in West Africa, wrote, "The city looks very big when you go into it. The houses in the town stand in good order as our Dutch houses are. These people are in no way inferior to the Dutch in cleanliness. They wash and scrub their houses so well that these are as polished as a looking glass." So full of praise for the city, the African city that they've gone into and what they found when they get there. And just a couple of hundred years later, obviously the attitudes of Europeans towards Africans and African civilization has completely done an about turn in terms of the derogatory ideas and the myths that are put about African society. And all sorts of prejudices did thrive in pre-capitalist society. I'm not pretending that this was a place of great enlightenment, of great, of great knowledge and of great understanding of difference. So you had still the ignorance and the suspicion of strangers. You had much less travel and much less knowledge of other parts of the world that you do from today. But racism is fundamentally different from this. Racism exists when an entire group of people are systematically discriminated against on the basis of characteristics that they are said to share. In some but not all circumstances, the group is defined by certain physical characteristics like skin colour. So anti-black racism is the classic example, but it's not just about skin colour, is it? Because we know, for example, well, the question of Muslims is a little bit more of a complicated question, because in part it's about a religion, but in part it is about blurring anybody now who's seen as Asian is seen as being a Muslim and therefore being treated in this racist way. But also, if you think about the stereotypes and the racism that Jewish people have faced or that Irish people have faced, again, it's not directly about skin colour, but it is about prescribing particular alleged characteristics to a group of people who are then systematically discriminated against. And that's what racism is really about. And the development of such a structured form of prejudice didn't exist prior to capitalism, despite whatever, like I said, whatever individual prejudices or suspicions people might have had. This kind of structuring and giving groups of people an inferior position in society didn't exist based on the idea of race, and the idea of race itself didn't exist at this time. And really what led to the rise of it was the rise of capitalism, and in particular a key phase in the beginning of capitalism, which is the transatlantic slave trade. You see, forms of slavery had existed before capitalism. They existed in medieval societies all over the world. Between the 10th and the 16th century, for example, the chief source of slaves in Western Europe was Eastern Europe. And actually that's where the word slave comes from. It comes from Slav, because Slavic people were the predominant source of slaves at that time. But the slave trade, as we came to know it, the transatlantic slave trade, took off on a massive scale when Portugal, Holland, England and France began growing sugar and tobacco in their colonies in the 17th century. And these crops required an enormous amount of labour. And to begin with, plantation owners would use indentured servants from Europe to provide it, basically people who were in debt, who would go there and work out the terms of their debt by basically working as servants, effectively kind of debt slaves for the capitalists on the plantations. These were mostly white-skinned debt slaves who were contracted to work for no wages for something between 3 to 5 years to pay off their debts. But very few of them actually survived to the end of their 5 years. And soon the demand for labour was such that the plantation owners couldn't fill it by just keep getting these debt slaves in, because these debt slaves were kind of, there weren't enough of them to supply the labour, and they were working them to death. And they began to look at this point to Africa to supplement their numbers. And by 1653, I think it is, African slaves actually outnumbered white labourers by almost 3 to 1 in countries such as Barbados. And where there were only 22,400 black people in the southern colonies of North America in 1700, just 70 years later, that had shot up to 409,500. And the slave traders and the owners had to try and justify their actions. Previously, they'd looked at ancient Greek and Roman texts to justify what they were doing. These texts had suggested that enslavement of people captured in just wars was legitimate, but it was difficult to stretch that definition to the hundreds of thousands and the extent of the mass enslavement and transportation and the horrific conditions in which that happened in the slave trade that they started from Africa. Because in what sense could they argue that enslaving over 6 million people transported into slavery during the 18th century alone, how could they justify this as being part of a just war? And also, they came up against a clash of ideologies, because this is the early days of capitalism, and capitalism, as we know, is based on the ideas of the free market, and it's based on an ideology of individual freedom. So, the founding declarations of American independence, all men are created equal, or the ideas of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity. So capitalism is based on an ideology of individual freedom and liberty, that all people should have equal opportunity, that all people are free to participate in the capitalist system. We all know that there are myths behind this because we don't all have the same freedoms, but this is the ideology that is absolutely central to capitalist society. And for the thinkers of the European Enlightenment and the people who defended and led the French Revolution, how could they explain the fact that their riches and their prosperity were based on the permanent and utterly brutal enslavement of millions of other human beings, and that those slaves would be transported across the oceans, and if they didn't die in the transport, would be worked to death within a few years of their arrival on the plantations. And the answer that they came up with to deal with this ideological contradiction was that if capitalism is based on equality for all humans, then Africans were not going to be treated as humans. And this is where you see the beginnings of an ideology coming from the capitalists, that Africans were treated as animals and therefore human rights didn't have to apply to them. And you see, it's a common argument today that mass slavery was the result of a racist worldview, that because the capitalists were racist, that's why we got the slave trade. But in actual fact, things happened the other way round. We had the slave trade, which created the ideas of racism. And it's not just us who's saying this. The black historian Eric Williams, a brilliant writer, wrote, "Slavery was not born of racism, rather racism was the consequence of slavery. The origins of Negro slavery was economic, not racial. It had not to do with the colour of the labourer, but the cheapness of the labour." So the racist ideas came about to justify slavery, and they were spread as a consequence of slavery and used to justify it against early opponents, particularly early opponents in the working class movement and those who challenged it beyond the working class movement, who challenged it on moral grounds. And some of the arguments that they used were religious ideas, the idea that the slaves were infidels and not Christians. But obviously this was only a short-term measure, because one of the things about religion was that you can change religion. So you can become a Christian, and therefore, if you're a slave, you become a Christian, then surely you should be freed. Racist ideology went much deeper than this. It guarded against this by saying that African people are a different race and are therefore not human. And in addition, there was also a problem for the plantation owners that many of their white, I talked earlier about many of the early people they brought to the plantations were white debt slaves, indentured labourers. And often they found that as they brought in slaves from Africa, that both the black and white slaves would make common cause, and they would make common cause with other people who lived in the Caribbean and elsewhere, and they would often make common cause, run away and attack their masters. In fact, there was a poem from one of the indentured labourers, one of the white indentured labourers that was written at the time, where a couple of the lines included, "We and the Negroes both alike did fare, of work and food we had equal share," that they saw a common cause. And one of the things that racism helped to do was it helped to drive a wedge, and it helped to divide and rule between the white indentured labourers and the black slaves. Incidentally, and we'll come on to this later, a wedge that we still see is a useful tool of capitalism that capitalism uses today, in terms of the way that racism is used to divide and rule people today. And we should always remember, I think, when we talk about slavery, about the absolute brutality on which it was based, and the absolute barbaric repression that was used by the slave owners in order to deter resistance. Just one description of the penalties that slaves in Barbados faced notes that the act of rebellion would be punished by nailing slaves down on the ground with crooked sticks on every limb, and then applying fire by degrees from feet and hands, burning them gradually up to the head, whereby their pains are extravagant. This is the daily brutality that slaves faced under the slave trade. But this absolutely crude and brutal system needed an intellectual veneer in order for it to become established, respectable and accepted by the capitalist classes across the world. And with the rich in the coffee houses of London knowing that their wealth was the result of such barbaric practices on the plantations, the extension of that justification and the kind of intellectual veneer that was given was not long in coming. So, for example, the English philosopher David Hume wrote in 1771, "I am apt to suspect that the Negroes are naturally inferior to the whites. There never was a civilised nation or any other complexion than white. No ingenious manufacturers among them, no arts, no sciences." Now, you're all students. You probably have a little bit of an understanding that the origins of civilization come from Africa and parts of the Middle East. And so, this is obviously a complete and utter rewriting of history, and one that we're still trying to unravel to this day. But it's a scientific gloss that was given to the ideas of racism, and soon theories were rife in which all peoples of the earth can be described as white, black, brown, red, yellow, despite the fact that obviously these categories don't relate actually to the skin colours that people have. And this categorisation of the world's populations and this creation of the notion of races didn't happen overnight. It happened unevenly over a period of time as the capitalist conquest spread from the pillage of Africa and the barbarities of slavery to turn their attentions to other parts of the world, to the colonialism in Asia, for example, and in some of the other conquests and battles that the European capitalists fought. Now, just to move on really, because I think we also have to remember that despite huge repression, there was a very powerful movement against slavery that grew up both on the plantations themselves, where rebellions increasingly took on an insurrectionary character, and in the slaveholding nations themselves, such as in England and in France, where working class people who worked in the mills and in the factories of northern cities that were at the heart of the Industrial Revolution in Britain made common cause with the slaves and were part of the resistance to slavery and part of the central core of the abolitionist movement in Britain. And you see, racism, as I said earlier, did more than justify the oppression of black slaves. It also served as a means of dividing the poor by trying to tie the interests of impoverished white farmers to those of slave-owning white elite. And this is one of the things that racism does. They tried to use it to divide and rule, to try to say that if you're white, you might be poor, but you're part of a superior nation and you have a position, of superiority over black people. And Frederick Douglass, the great black anti-slavery campaigner, wrote it this way. He said, "The hostility between the whites and blacks of the US Deep South is easily explained. It has its root and sap in the relation of slavery and was incited on both sides by the poor whites and blacks by putting enmity between them. They divided both to conquer each." And that phrase, "they divided both to conquer each," is something we should keep in our minds, I think, when we think about racism and the role that racism plays today. Now, racism after this point, obviously people ask, why was it that racism survived after the end of slavery? And racism has been repeatedly reinvented since the end of slavery, not one time but many times. We've seen it used by colonial powers to justify why they were able to directly rule over Africans and Asians and other people, the way in which, people were treated, I suppose, as children. And we actually see this treating of people as children in colonial conquest as recently as the Iraq War. You talk about how they talked about putting funds in trust because the Iraqi people aren't capable of governing themselves. This whole ideology of people in the Middle East and people in Asia are somehow children that have to be ruled by Western imperialism is something that we saw very much through the colonial powers. That, you think just about Rudyard Kipling's poems about the white man's burden, and this is exactly where this comes from. Racism then got a further theoretical boost from the new forms of science that were a distorted version of Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection. Now the different races were said to be suited to different roles in society because of a difference in their biologies. Indeed, humanity would be stronger, apparently, according to the racists, if the inferior races were wiped out altogether. I'll skip that bit. Actually, no. There's so Professor Carper Pearson, who actually taught at the University of London at the turn of the century, chillingly prefigured the Nazis by saying, "History shows one way, and only one way, in which a high state of civilization has been produced, namely the struggle of race with race and the survival of the physically and mentally fitter race." So you not only have now the creation of absolute division of the world into races, you have the scientific demands that one race is more superior and that this is somehow a natural phenomenon. And I want to end really by moving on to where does this leave us in terms of resistance. Because I said earlier that what ended slavery was a mixture of some absolutely and utterly inspiring revolts by slaves in the plantations. And, the most important one of these is the one that happened in Haiti, in what is called Haiti today, in Saint-Domingue, led by a coachman slave, Toussaint, who took the name Toussaint Louverture, meaning the opening, as in the opening to liberty, who led an utterly inspiring revolutionary struggle against slavery in that country, But on every plantation, people didn't take their slavery. People organised, they rebelled, they burnt down their owners' houses, they fought absolutely bravely against slavery. And as I said, at the same time, you saw acts of resistance in Britain, and the author Peter Fryer has written a fantastic book, Staying Power, The History of Black People in Britain, which doesn't just look at the history of black people in Britain, it looks at the history of the common cause that workers of all nationalities and colours and races, whatever you want to call it, in Britain, including white working class people in Britain, have had in the role of fighting against racism. And just to give you one example, a mass meeting organised by radicals in Sheffield in 1794, where thousands of workers unanimously passed a resolution calling for emancipation of black slaves, where they said, wishing to be rid of the weight of oppression under which we groan, we are induced to compassion with those who groan also. We will avenge peacefully ages of wrongs done to our Negro brethren. And in mass meetings of workers, the country over, people voted to support the rights of slaves to kill their owners. They supported that they made common cause with what was being done to them in the factories of Manchester and Sheffield, with what was being done, again in the name of capitalism, on the slave plantations. And these are the combination of forces that really brought slavery to an end. And as I said, racism didn't end with slavery. It's been reinvented time and again to justify colonialism, at the end of colonialism, to justify dividing and ruling the working class. And we see that very much, I think, today with the scapegoating that goes on. We can see for a ruling class under pressure and a ruling class in crisis, what is more useful than to be able to say, the problem is not our austerity, the problem is not the bankers, the problem is not the capitalist system, look over there, the problem is the Bulgarians want to take your services, the problem is that the Muslims don't want to integrate. This is classic scapegoating, and this is how capitalism uses and stokes racism today. And so what I think we learn from this is that racism is not natural. People are not born racists. Racism isn't a phenomenon that has always existed. It emerges from a key moment in the beginnings of capitalism, and it persists today because of the useful role that it plays for the capitalist class. And what that also means is that it's not just about a battle of ideas. The battle of ideas is absolutely central, and we have to fight against all racist ideas, against racist language, against racist imagery, and against the ideas that people accept about racism. But it's not just about ideas. It also means that we have to see that white working class people are not inherently racist, that white working class people can be part of the solution and not part of the problem, and that we have an interest in uniting black and white people together against the common enemy. And at the end of the day, if racism came out of the early days of capitalism, the abolition and getting rid of racism has got to be bound up with the abolition of capitalism, of class society altogether. And that means for us fighting every expression of racism. We're not waiting for some glorious revolutionary future. We have to fight now against every manifestation of racism. But we also have to say, we don't want to be fighting the same battles that black people fought when they came to Britain in the 60s and 70s. We don't want to be fighting the same battles that Muslims are fighting today over Islamophobia, the same battles that Jewish people faced in the 30s and that Irish people faced again and again at different times in history in Britain. We want an end to this cycle, and that means looking to a future without class society, without capitalism, and also without racism.
I wanted to kind of know if people have seen Django Unchained, the new film that's come out, because I actually thought it was brilliant. Because what you have is, as Esme was saying, the complete brutality of slavery really being shown. You have a really horrible reaction, but it really highlights the fact that this brutality was entirely based on the need for profit. And so there's the scene where one of the slaves has become no longer able to create any more value for the slave owner. They can't work anymore, and so they are simply fed to the dogs, because as a living thing they can no longer provide the kind of free labour that was all that was required of them. And the other thing though that I wanted to focus on that was in the film that I thought was highlighted really well was this kind of naturalisation of the difference between races. So there's a moment where Leonardo DiCaprio, who's a plantation owner, has the skull of a black person, and he's sort of pointing out, this old practice of phrenology, pointing out the differences in the black person's skull from the white person's skull, which shows why they'll always be subordinate, why they'll always be in this position in society, and using science to back these things up. And I think this is really interesting because, I mean, I was a psychology student, and I was really shocked when, I think it was last year or the year before, when there was an evolutionary psychologist at the LSE who claimed that genetically black women were less attractive than white women, and posed this on some, completely ludicrous research base. And yet, you have this research still coming out today, trying to pose this sort of, moved on from phrenology of looking at bumps in the skull, but actually it's moved on to genetics and looking at, these sort of differences, supposed genetic differences. And I think the important point we can always make is actually, from a scientific standpoint, there's actually more genetic variation between people of the same race than there is between races, and actually this means, the genetic variation comes down to, it's completely meaningless when we're talking about race. I think the other important point of the kind of way that science has been used to talk about racism itself, never mind the sort of differences between races, is in psychology the explanation for why large numbers of people are racist. And so at first you have this sort of explanation which says that, it's something to do with the fact that, we are different races, so we automatically hate other people who aren't the same as us. It's something to do with, dissimilarity. Then you have a moving on to what was called the frustration aggression hypothesis, where they looked at the sort of number of lynchings of black people compared to the market rates for cotton. And basically they showed that when the cotton prices were low, lynchings were higher. So when people were doing economically worse and they were somehow very frustrated, they immediately turned this aggression onto black people. And this is still extremely problematic, even though it's tying into the economic arguments. It's still saying that automatically, when we're worried about our economic situation, when we're in time of crisis, when we're in time that our economic conditions are not being met, we immediately turn against other people. And actually, there was a new body of research done in the 1980s which showed that without specific groups actually feeding this ideology, feeding the idea that the reason you're in a bad economic position is because of these other people. Without that, people don't, automatically jump to the conclusion that the reason that they're unemployed, the reason that they can't get their benefits, the reason that there aren't enough places in the school for their kids, that people don't automatically jump to the conclusion that's because of outsiders, that's because of immigrants. Actually, you need these, need specific groups in society actually fueling this ideology. And I think in a time of very deep economic crisis, when we have groups in Britain like the English Defence League who are fueling these ideas, it's ever more important that we're tackling where these ideas of racism come from, actually what they're founded in, and why people come to hold racist ideas. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Yes?
Well, I haven't seen Django myself actually, but I was sort of having conversations with people about it, and the reason I haven't watched it is because I've just heard lots of people just saying it's just another blaxploitation film, just another white man making a film about black people's plight to further his fame. So I kind of avoided that, but that wasn't the point I was trying to make. I was kind of going to agree with what Fraser was saying about there's still so much institutionalized racism within psychology and stuff like that. I'd seen the thing about the black women being scientifically less attractive, and I was talking to my uncle about that because he's a university lecturer in psychology, and he was saying that the man who wrote that article has been coming out with racist, awful stuff for ages, and I think it was only for some reason that particular article caught everyone's attention, and suddenly there was a backlash and he was disciplined. But there is constantly these racist sort of research and proof and stuff being published, and the thing that, because I think it's easy to say, oh, just don't accept racist racist pseudoscience, but it's difficult if you're not as academic as these researchers, and how can you sort of challenge that when they're obviously coming from a place where they've been working for years and years and years on whatever, and that actually it's kind of coming from more of a racist place than actual science or whatever. But how can you sort of challenge that when you're not at their level? I don't really know where you would start there.
Thank you. would you like to come back on some of the issues?
I
Sorry.
think there's some more there.
I want to talk a bit about, I've not seen the film Django Unchained, but I do think it's quite important that there are films and sort of popular culture that do actually examine and look at the history of racism. One thing about the fight against slavery in the US, I think that's quite important to note, is how actually the defeat of slavery was won. And it's actually a myth, I think, that it's taught in history books, that, you know, the Civil War and the sort of the blues led by Abraham Lincoln came down and liberated the slaves in the Confederacy dominated Southern America. And all you have to do is start to peel back some of those myths to understand that actually what really was at the heart of the fight against slavery was actually on the plantations themselves and the uprisings of slaves and of some ordinary people as well in America. And that actually it wasn't until 2 years into the Civil War that Lincoln developed or brought out the Emancipation Proclamation, which added demands around the end of abolition with within the demands of the Unionists. And I think that's incredibly important to understand. And that, if anything, it was the desire to win the war and the development of industrialization in northern US, I think, that actually pushed Lincoln to put forward those demands. So we need to understand that it wasn't necessarily in any way some anti-racist hand from above, but it actually was from pressure. It was from the pressure of the threat of the Confederates winning, from pressure from the slaves who were uprising, and the desire to win the war. I want to talk a little bit as well about racism today, and specifically Islamophobia. And I just think it's very interesting how it's almost a slippery slope where how racism and religion and anti-religion sentiment can become intertwined. And I think on the left we have to be incredibly careful and nuanced with the way in which we make the arguments, and especially when it comes to Islamophobia, because there was an excellent speaker that came to talk at Middlesex about fascism and racism, and so one of our students said, well, you know, actually we think there's some real problems with religion, and perhaps especially what you might call extreme Islam or whatever. But then they made an excellent comeback and they said, well, look, you don't see, if anything, what's the dominant religion actually in Britain today? It's the Church of England. That's where all the money is poured behind. But you don't have all these people coming out and saying that they're really worried about the dominance of extreme, you know, Christian ideas or whatever. And I think that's it. We have to really look at where the balance of class forces are and be able to kind of broaden it out a little bit and understand. It's like what Thomas said in the last talk. It's about the heart and the heartless world, and understanding why, in a way, why people do look to religion, but also why we understand that the way that we fight is through unity. And it was really evident in the Egyptian Revolution, the story that loads of people have heard, but about, you know, Christians surrounding Muslims that they could pray in Tahrir Square, and then vice versa with secular groups involved as well. I thought that was a little bit of a glimpse of saying, actually, it's not, religion isn't the problem right now. It's sometimes used by the ruling classes to help to create divisions, but it's not that, it's the capitalist system that's the problem.
Thank you. Is anybody else? Huh?
I was wondering what you would kind of suggest to dispel these ideas that are kind of being constantly fed to people, because it's just sort of relentless, because like, it's easy to sort of come here and be told this, but it's not being brought to general attention. It's like, I was talking to a neighbour the other day, we were talking about something totally irrelevant. We were talking about how it was a shame that people don't talk to their neighbours anymore, people not kind of have sort of communities and stuff, and she said, oh, it's because the foreigners keep coming and going and they're not friendly enough. And it's just like, that's clearly kind of coming from certain sort of Daily Mail and stuff, and just like politicians sort of using scapegoats, but there's nothing to really combat it.
Thank you.
I think it's also a similar issue, like a misconception that people have is that racism is often defined very, very narrowly as explicit prohibitions on certain people, so that, for example, a white person can be racist if he's not allowed to use the N-word. Well, I mean, like there can be racism against white people and so on and so forth. All that it's defined very narrowly in terms of individual prejudices that people have, and how do you think that these are best countered?
Yes?
I suppose it's just following up on that idea that in modern society today, racism has moved on from traditional forms. So we've always had sort of racism against black people. There's a long history of that. But now that's also moved to, perhaps in some cases, racism against white people from maybe others who feel they're not accepted by white people, etc., etc. And it's just, I feel like there's a larger scope in society today for racism from different groups towards each other. Whereas before there were just certain groups that were sort of isolated and prejudiced against. Now that has kind of encompassed far many more groups in society.
Thank you.
Can I come back to that?
Yeah, sure.
Just I completely reject the idea that like racism doesn't work that way. You can't have people being racist towards white people. You can have people being prejudiced or discriminatory or rude to white people, but because white people in our society are they have the power, it's kind of like you can't, like racism is, I don't know, it's kind of difficult, like.
No, I think you're right. I think that's sorry. I think I said perhaps the wrong phrasing. That's sort of what I was trying to say. Not exactly racism against white people, because of course, as you say, white people very much dominate society. But there is sort of divisions between perhaps black people and white people, where black people will judge white people in certain ways as well. And that
I think when that kind
goes both ways.
Yeah, I think when that kind of thing happens, like I think when you've got people from marginalised ethnicities sort of discriminating against white people, I think that comes from, that's a kind of a defence, that comes from a kind of, well, you know, if you've had this history of constantly being shat on by white people, eventually you're going to be like, I don't want to look at another white person, I can't stand them anymore.
Yeah, so it's reactionary.
Yeah, so it comes from a completely different place, yeah.
Can I ask a quick question on that? I mean, I take your point about black people towards white people, but what about, say, the Irish or Polish people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, yeah, I think it kind of, it's difficult to sort of say in terms of that, but I think like, so, because if you look at Irish people, that's not, like people are, like Irish people have been, you know, oppressed and but that's not racism towards white people, that's racism towards Irish people. And people, like when people were being so discriminatory towards Irish people, they were seeing them, they were painting them as not like the rest of the white people kind of thing. It was separating them and being like, and you still have these like these caricatures of their different features and stuff that would separate them from the rest of white people. So it was kind of, it was seeing them as a different race than white people. So it kind of, it wasn't a people being racist towards white people. It was a completely different thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does actually. Yes. Sorry about that.
I think it comes from kind of narrow sense of unity, and like people kind of seem to make assumptions about other groups, and sort of it's almost like they're reacting to something that hasn't, like, it's like people assume that people can be against them, and it happens between racial groups as well. Like I was at the bus stop and like there's a really ugly Indian woman, and there's a group of like black students, and then she was like, oh, they're so loud, and she sort of went, oh, but they don't have a right to be here. She was like, they shouldn't be lucky to be here, they wouldn't see someone like this in a million years, you know, they shouldn't be pushing their luck or something. And I was just thinking, like, you know, like, how can you say that when you're a racial minority as well?
Hmm.
I'm dominating now, but I just have a lot of opinions. I think with the thing you're talking about, that, like, I think you can, it's sort of an internalization. Like I see that a lot where you'll get a marginalized group being awful to another marginalised group. And I think that is a sort of internalisation. Like you even see it, like if you talk about like you see women being really awful and like to other women and sort of thing. I think it does, like, it's just the kind of if you as like if I as a brown person can like say, like, separate this whole other group and just be like, oh, you know, oh, these black people, like, I'm better than them. It's kind of like I can try and raise, it's an attempt to raise yourself up out of the racism that you already experienced, but like, you know, it doesn't work like that. But it's kind of like this attempt to stop yourself from being targeted by targeting other people. Which, yeah.
Okay.
Just to chip it on, I think it's important to remember as well where the dominant ideas in society come from. Because actually that's where racism really does come from. It's from the fact that all of our leadership and the media and everything, the capitalist class, constantly are saying that actually we should be pitted against each other. And this is where we can see it now from the scapegoating going on with immigrants increasingly being blamed for the financial crisis. Theresa May can easily get up and say we need to cut net migration by tens of thousands. Well then, you know, it's understandable then that will come and manifest itself on both ordinary white and black and Asian people in this country. The real question is, how do we fight it? Because, so in other words, what I mean to say is I was out selling Socialist worker the other day, and met a couple of young workers from Eastern Europe, and they were saying that there's been a massive problem with immigration in the country, and that we need to be cutting immigration. That's part of the problem, and it's about people stealing benefits and da 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 da. And I was thinking, wow, you know, it's so frustrating when you actually when you're actually of such a common cause, when you're being faced with people, with immigrants as well who are using racist arguments. So what we need to do is we need to try to unravel those racist arguments and actually talk more about where the real enemies are, and the real enemies are the ruling classes that are trying to divide us. And on the question of racism against white people, I mean, at the end of the day, I think we have to go back to Esme's definition of racism, because it has to do with systematic division and oppression. And in our society at the moment, that oppression is focused at people who are immigrants to our country, and America as well, to immigrants to that country. And it's very hypocritical because our countries, of course, are actually based upon immigration. And so I think we need to be very clear in a way that when it comes to sort of, we first off defend the right to self-defense, and especially for oppressed groups to self-defense. And then we also talk about what's the best way to fight. It is through unity. So therefore we have zero tolerance as far as racism from anyone, whether you're black, Asian, white, whatever. But we do fight on a way of saying that we have unity, and we understand that in our society, white people aren't oppressed. We might have oppression from one way or the other, whether we're women or LGBT or whatever, we might be oppressed. We're not oppressed because of the colour of our skin or whatever, our culture at this point in time. Our interest is to fight and try to get over it, fight against it.
Okay. Yes?
I think, if you think about it, like the media or just a lot of people in authority, they fixate on culture and the division between it. And if you break it down, like, what is culture? What is the difference? Like living in London, my culture fuses with like everything else. Like if I was to break it down and actually state what it is, it's just like eating different food from you, but that doesn't necessarily mean I don't eat the same food as you as well. Or like in terms of religion, I'm praying 5 times a day. It's just, if you break it down, it's like we're not very different. And I just think it's just really ridiculous how eating different food or eating or wearing like different clothes, but that's not very different at the same time, creates such division and such a backlash. So when you break it down, we're doing the same things in a different way. Like we all wear clothes, but some clothes will be like it's like we all do the same things, but in different ways, if that makes sense. And it's just weird that how you have so much backlash against racism because like you do those things due to your race or your religion. Whereas if you've got people who have a different way of life and that was not due to your race or religion, this sort of valued for being an individual, if that makes sense. Whereas, yeah, it's just really strange.
Yeah?
This is kind of a different point, but what I find really worrying and what almost really angers me in society today is how and perhaps certain people who have sort of historically would have been part of a group such as the Irish or the Jewish or black people or any sort of minority group who would have been prejudiced against years ago now see themselves, because perhaps they were born in London but they had immigrant parents that kind of do view themselves as being British and are actually willing now to become racist towards other new immigrant groups coming in. And I just feel it's so hypocritical, and I feel increasingly that I think it's almost, I think Obama said a quote recently to do with it as well, and it's how most of us don't realise that we come from immigrant families. London is multicultural, and so now we're sort of seeking to blame immigrants for our current economic crisis, but we're immigrants ourselves. It's a completely hypocritical idea. Yeah.
I think that's a slightly unhelpful way of thinking about it. Really, it's not hypocrisy. It's people people aligning with what they see as their own interests. Like people in the city might think of that might even though they come from immigrant parents. I mean, Obama comes to mind for a start. I mean, he's I mean, he might have black skin, but he doesn't have the his interests are very much aligned with those of the dominant white group. So we shouldn't expect him to be. It's not hypocrisy that he doesn't fight for black people. It's just it's his interests.
Yeah, I understand that, and I think that's what I'm saying. I think that's the problem. I think maybe we need to come to terms with the fact that I'm from an Irish family, my parents are Irish, but I've grown up in London. I do see myself as a Londoner. I see myself as British as well in some ways. But I feel like as I grow up, I don't. So I'm not phrasing myself very well today, which is probably part of the problem. But I just feel as though we need to sort of remember perhaps where we come from. And yes, maybe my ideas, as you sort of said, as an example with Obama, they do become aligned. It doesn't matter where you come from, they become aligned with who you are in society today. You're defined by your ancestors and where you're from. But I feel like we should keep in mind that where we come from. And so, because to me it is like, you're right, maybe it isn't hypocrisy, maybe that's the wrong word, but we do have to maintain the idea of at least kind of think about where we're from, and perhaps that can help us to stop racism in the future, because this is brilliant. This is a multicultural society. I love London because you have hundreds of different races all in one city working together most of the time. And I think as long as we maintain that, we can prevent against future ideas of blaming immigrants when things go wrong in society, because we come from immigrant families ourselves. And, sorry.
Okay. Yes, Ian.
The point that you made earlier, I think that because we're Marxists, we have we focus on material and economic things, and I think that possibly we can neglect the kind of cultural interests that people have in maintaining their own identity. So maybe you're right that our attitude might be counterproductive, but in this respect. Nevertheless, the focus still has to be on unity, doesn't it? On uniting people on the basis that their interests are not so different.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So by focusing on identity, we're separating people rather than thinking, okay, we're all human, we're all in the same struggle together, so let's move on from that. But focusing on identity politics, it just kind of, separates people rather than bringing us together.
Okay. What I propose to do is take one more contribution before Esme sums up, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, off you.
Really short. I just wanted to add on to what you were saying, that whilst a class-based analysis is really, really important for all the reasons you said, I won't repeat them. I just think that also it's important to not forget how you can still be, completely in the totally upper echelons of society and be black and be discriminated against. Like if you look at Obama, like anyway, we keep talking about Obama, but all of the racist abuse that has been everywhere before he got in, since he got in, like all sorts, like bellying criticism about the fact that he's doing terrible things, like in terms of drones and stuff. But like no, everyone criticises him because he's black. And also like if you look to like the racist abuse that people like like famous A-list black people get and stuff, it's you can't even if you manage to, even if you're like in the sort of the ruling classes and stuff, you still can't escape racism. I think we should always remember that.
Thank you.
Well, I think that was a great discussion, actually. I think it's raised a lot of really interesting points, and I'm sure we're not going to get to the bottom of all of them just right now. I hope people come to the next meeting on racism, which is about the struggle from the civil rights movement through Black Power to Obama, because I think that will help to draw out some of the themes that we've been discussing. Just a couple of things that I wanted really to talk, to reply to the discussion about. The first one is about this notion of culture, because I think you raised it really well, because it's one of the things that makes me really, really irritated and annoyed when they talk about defending the British culture and defending us from an alien culture. It's like, what is this British culture? It's based on a notion that we all, just because you're British or you're born in Britain, or actually they mean white British culture, they don't really mean British culture, but they mean that there is some unity of culture that encompasses people like David Cameron and working class people who work in a factory or in a hospital. We do not have the same culture in Britain. Your culture depends on whether you're rich and powerful or whether you're part of the working class. And you're right, we all have the same culture. We might wear slightly different clothes or whatever, but we go to school together, we go to university together, we struggle to get jobs together, we eat different foods. We're part of the same culture, aren't we? We face the same problems in our lives. And so this notion that there is a British culture is an absolutely elitist notion for starters, and it's based on a whole load of myths. If you want to talk about what the real British culture that David Cameron stands for, it stretches right back to empire and all the oppressive things that I'm talking about, the slave trade and all the rest of it. This is not a culture I want to be associated with, or that anyone else here wants to be associated with. So when they say the British culture, we can say, well, you can have your oppressive, disgusting culture. That's what we're trying to get rid of. We want a culture of resistance, of ordinary people reclaiming society, black and white, Asian, Jewish, all together, claiming those things together. So that's on that. The other thing I thought was interesting about the discussion is that if you remember at the beginning of the discussion, there was quite a lot about psychology, because I think it's true. I talked about in the way that racism has been reinvented, is that lots of the original ideas of scientific racism were discredited with the Holocaust. The ideas that you could, the phrenology, the measuring brains, a lot of this was discredited after the Holocaust. But these ideas make comebacks in other ways, don't they? And genetics is the latest kind of supposedly sophisticated way in which racist ideas come back, and not just ideas about race, but ideas about all aspects of human behaviour. Every so often they discover a gene for criminality, which is just the most bizarre way to understand crime in society. What constitutes crime, why people might commit crime, is because somehow they've been born with a criminal gene. I mean, it's really not a serious attempt to engage with how society works. And so, in one way, when you say how can we challenge them at their level, to be honest, I think their level is fairly weak. But I do think it's right that we should look at and go back to and study some of the studies that good scientists on our side have done that look at the things that people were saying about that actually, when you sensibly look at the question of genes, there is more genetic variety between people who are supposedly in the same race than between different races. That, genetics does not explain what they call race. And that actually race has no actual scientific, biological or psychological basis. Race is something that is a false category that has been created and is being used, and we should just keep coming back to that point. And it's interesting because there are battles in this all the time. I've got a friend who is a psychologist who studied psychology in Edinburgh at a time when actually one of her lecturers was a racist lecturer who was pushing a lot of these ideas. He was called Chris Brand. And she actually ended up leading a walkout of all psychology students out of one of his lecture, she describes it as the most scary moment of her life when she stood up and said, I'm not putting up with being taught by this racist, your ideas are totally discredited, and walked out the door hoping that people would come with her. And they did. And actually he ended up getting sacked because they fought. And I think if we see lecturers coming out and supposed scientists and academics coming out with this racist shit, we should campaign against them, because we have to really fight this back and say this is not acceptable in academia, and this is part of taking on some of their ideas and building some strength against it. Just a couple of other things. People raise the question, which often comes up, about can people be racist against white people? To be honest, I think we've solved that actually in the discussion, but it does come back to this question of what we mean about racism, and racism isn't just about individual prejudice or just about the individual relationships or the ideas people have. It's about a structural power difference that exists in society. So when a white person is prejudicial towards a black person, they are cutting with the dominant ideas that come from the top of society about black people are inferior and white people are superior, and that is racism. When a black person responds to that, like you say, by going, I hate white people, that is a response to racism, and that's very different to racism. So I don't believe you can have racism by oppressed groups against white people. That isn't to say that there isn't any racism against any white people. As people have talked about, there's a very big history of racism against Irish people, and as you point out, it's specifically about trying to portray Irish people as not part of the rest of the white race. And it's interesting when you look at the cartoons of Irish people that existed around the time that Marx was writing about racism, where he specifically talked about Irish people and how the divide and rule between Irish people and English white workers at that time, he calls it the secret of the impotence of the working class. It was one of his key revelations about racism, about how the divisions between Irish and British workers was used to divide and rule and hold people down. But if you look at the cartoons that were used in popular culture at that time about Irish people, they're very similar to a lot of the cartoons that are used about black people, portraying people, animalistic, with grotesque features, just kind of the dehumanisation that happened, very, very similar. But just because we say that lots of different groups have faced racism and face racism today doesn't automatically mean that we get a unity of the oppressed. And that's one of the things that people have expressed very well, the frustration that we feel that why is it that generations of immigrants or second generation immigrants can't understand that what's being done to Eastern Europeans today or to Muslims today is what was done to their family when they moved here. And it's very frustrating, isn't it? I find it really frustrating that people don't automatically see those things. And I think one of the things, people are right, that we have to remind people is that Britain is a nation that is built on immigration. There wouldn't be a Britain if it hadn't been for generations of different immigrants, and it's partly what makes Britain an okay place to live despite the weather and the austerity and everything else. It's one of the things that makes it not such a terrible place to live, that it is a nation built on immigration. And it's true, there is no unity of the oppressed, and it's one of the things that we have to really fight for. And you could see actually around the riots attempts to stoke up divisions, for example, between black people of African Caribbean descent and Asian people, and there were attempts to pit people or against Turkish people in Hackney. So there was attempts to divide and rule in that way. And one of the things that we did was we tried to organise responses to the riots, meetings, demonstrations that tried to bring people together to say the real problem is the scapegoating of young people and the lack of opportunities, and not to allow different groups to be divided in this way. It's similar actually. There was a couple of years ago, there was a very tense time in Birmingham where there were myths put around about, I can't remember which way round it was, I think it was about Asian people grooming young people, black people, and there was a real tension. I can't remember, like I say, I can't remember the details of which way round it was, but there was a real tension in parts of Birmingham around Handsworth between Asian people and black people, and members of the Socialist Workers' Party, Asian, black and white, all went down to that area and tried to talk to people and leafleted, and actually were part of trying to organise a collective working class response to the problems that people faced in that area, and to dispel some of the myths and to calm things down and to try and organise on a community basis across different groups, and did it actually very successfully. And sometimes these arguments are very difficult, but we do sometimes have to have them. And I'll finish really with a little bit about how racism works, because I think it's absolutely right that we have to remember that racism comes from the top of society, you know, one of the things that I'm telling you all the things that annoy me. One of the other things that really annoy me is this idea that working class people are somehow more racist. And this is something that the politicians try and do. This is what they do about Eastleigh, don't they? They go, oh, look at all, you know, it's not us. The politicians try and pretend it's not them that are racist. They're very, very enlightened and they're part of polite society and all the rest of it. But look at these, you know, lumpen white workers. They've got racist ideas and we have to pander to them. This isn't how racism works. Racism comes from the politicians at the top of society who say there is a problem with immigration, and they say it at every chance they get, and they say British jobs for British workers. They say they feed all of these ideas that the problems we face are because there are, you know, huge families of Asians or Poles coming over and taking all our jobs and all our services, and then they point the finger at the people who might believe some of those ideas and say, look, you're really stupid for believing them. But they started all of this. These ideas come from the top of society because they benefit the top of society. And there are lots and lots of sociological studies that show just how much this benefits the capitalist class, that when you're able to divide and rule. There was a very famous study about states in the southern states of America, where they looked state by state where the levels of racism and therefore the division in wages between black and white were higher. So where there were more racism, actually everybody's wages were lower. And so it shows that where they're able to divide and rule, it drags everybody down. And so it's a very, very useful tool for them. And it's a particularly useful tool in times of austerity, because somehow they have to explain to people why this economic crisis has happened, why, you know, there might be massive cuts in the hospitals and the schools, in university places. And funnily enough, they don't really want to own up and say it's their fault that capitalism is in crisis and that there aren't enough services and all the rest of it. So they have to find somebody to blame, and, you know, immigrants obviously are a very useful thing for them. And that kind of comes back to people talking about, you know, how do we deal with this? Because you're right, it is a common argument that you face, even with people who agree with us about lots and lots of things, can accept some of the ideas about, but aren't there too many people coming in? But, you know, I agree with you. But I had somebody yesterday that when we were petitioning outside Unite Against Fascism conference who signed the petition, yes, I hate bankers, but I do think there are too many immigrants in the country. And you have to start to try and tease apart some of these arguments and to try and win people to why do we face the problems that we face. You know, no, it's not immigrants who are closing A&E departments across London. You know, it's not immigrants who are doing that, it's the Tories who are doing that. And you can go through lots and lots of different examples. I think we have to just keep trying to point the reality back onto where the problems in society really come from. And we have to do that in argument, and we won't always win it in argument, but we have to start it in argument, and then we have to try and win it through united struggle. And I think united struggle is what gives people the confidence to feel that they have power instead of the weakness to look for other people to blame. And that's one of the reasons that struggle is so important to us. And just on the final points, really, there's a discussion that's begun here, really, I think, about the strategies for fighting racism, because it is true that racism affects people, whatever part of society they're in. It does affect Obama and his family, and it does affect you if you're a black worker working on the buses. It affects everybody in society, and we oppose racism wherever it affects people. But it affects you differently. If you're Obama and you have a bit of money, you do have to put up with some racist crap, but you're not the same as a black person competing at the bottom of the labour market where black people are concentrated, or you're not one of the, you know, the working class black men who are more likely to find themselves in prison than in college if you're in America. And one of the things that's happened is that out of the struggles against racism that we've had in the past, they have opened the door to people like Obama being able to find themselves in positions of leadership and positions of power. Now, that's a good thing. It's entirely right that black people should have the right to be the president of America, but it doesn't deal with the systematic racism that still exists in society and that is faced predominantly by working class black people. Because, to be honest, if you're black, you're still more likely to be part of the working class than you are to be the top echelons of society anyway. And our strategy for liberation is more than just opening the door to more black people getting into positions of authority and positions of power. Our strategy for liberation is about all black and Asian and white and Jewish and Irish and everybody having the chance to move forwards and chance to be part of a different society. And that's why I agree with people who who have argued, somebody argued here quite rightly, that identity politics doesn't help us in this, because identity politics stresses the difference between us, and it dwells not just on the difference between us, but I think it pictures people as part of the problem where that's not necessarily the case. Because one of the things when you start to talk about identity politics is you say, well, all black people are part of the solution, all white people are part of the problem, just because of their identity. And this isn't the case. And that's why I think we have to come back to a class strategy, because class in society is not just one of a myriad of inequalities. We have gender differences, we have sexuality differences, we have race differences, and we have class differences. It's not just one of a myriad of inequalities. Class is about how capitalism exploits profit from us. And tied into capitalism and the exploitation of class are all those other oppressions that go with it, the sexuality, the sexism, and the racism. Class is about understanding where the potential to unlock that comes from. Black and white people, part of the working class, have an interest in a way that people who are part of the ruling class, black, white, men, women, don't have, of getting rid of the system as a whole. And getting rid of the system as a whole is how we challenge racism as a whole, and how we have a strategy that's not just about levering ourselves into positions of power, but it's about changing the whole of society. And it's an exciting time, I think, to think about how we do that. The struggles against the EDL and against the BNP have absolutely shown the potential to unite trade unionist students, black, white, that there is a real, I think there is, despite the arguments we have about immigrants, there is a proud tradition in Britain of anti-racism that we have fought and we've defeated generation after generation, that the fascists come back and we fight them back. And there is a proud tradition of doing that, but we don't want future generations to have to go through this all over again, and we have to think, we want to get beyond just fighting the manifestations of racism and fascism, and we want to link it to a struggle that we say these things we could have a society where these things don't exist at all, and that's about fighting for socialism.